I built her a palace. Spent 2 years turning her dream into stone and glass. She cried when I showed her the blueprints. Kissed me in front of her whole family. Now, I can't even walk through the gate. Security stops me like I'm a stranger. And she watches from the balcony, the one I designed for us, without saying a word. I stood on the half-finished balcony watching the sun drop behind the hills of Davao. The air smelled like rain and fresh concrete. Cynthia wrapped her arms around me from behind and pressed her face against my shoulder. "This is our forever, Garrett," she whispered. Her breath was warm on my neck. I closed my eyes and let myself believe it. I wanted to believe it so badly. "You really think so?" I asked, turning to face her. She nodded, her dark eyes catching the last light of the day. "I know so," she said. "You gave me something no one ever has. A real home. A real future." I kissed her forehead and held her close. My chest felt tight, like I'd been holding my breath for years and finally remembered how to exhale. I'd been in the Philippines for 8 months, and I'd never felt more alive. Back in Massachusetts, I was just a grieving widower rattling around a cold house that still smelled like my wife's perfume. Every room was a reminder of what I'd lost. I couldn't sleep in our bedroom anymore. I couldn't sit in the living room without seeing her in the chair by the window, so I left. Bought a one-way ticket and told myself I just needed some time away. But then I met Cynthia at a coffee shop in the city. She was working behind the counter, laughing with customers, moving like she had music in her head. When she smiled at me, I felt something I thought was dead. Hope, maybe, or just the memory of what hope used to feel like. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, still in my arms on that balcony. I shook my head. "Just how different everything is now," I said. "Good different?" she asked. I nodded. "Yeah, good different." She kissed me then, soft and slow, and I thought about how this villa wasn't just a house. It was proof that I could still build something beautiful, that I wasn't too old to start over, that life didn't end when my wife died. "You make me feel safe, Garrett," Cynthia said, pulling back to look at me. "Like nothing bad can happen as long as you're here." I held her tighter. I wanted to be that for her. I wanted to be someone's safety, someone's home. "I'm not going anywhere," I told her, and I meant it. I really did. The construction crew had left for the day, and it was just the two of us standing in the skeleton of what would become our life together. 3 bedrooms, open concept kitchen, wrap-around balcony overlooking the garden. I'd drawn every line myself, spent hours getting the measurements perfect. This wasn't just some retirement fantasy. This was real. This was mine. Ours. "Show me again where the prayer room will be," she said, taking my hand. I walked her through the space, pointing out where the walls would go, where the windows would let in morning light. She stopped in the corner I designated for her mother's prayer space and covered her mouth with her hand. "You really did that for me?" she asked. Her voice broke a little. "Of course I did," I said. "Your family's important to you. That makes them important to me." She turned and wrapped her arms around my neck. "I love you," she said. 3 words I hadn't heard in 2 years. 3 words I didn't think I'd ever hear again. "I love you too," I said, and I felt the weight of my grief lift just a little bit more. We stood there as the sky turned purple and the first stars came out. The city lights flickered on in the distance. Somewhere down the hill a dog barked. Motorcycles buzzed past on the road. Everything felt possible. Everything felt right. "When it's done," Cynthia said quietly, "we'll have a big party. Invite everyone. Show them what we built." "What I built for you," I corrected. She smiled. "What we built together," she said. I kissed her hand. I thought I was building us a home. I didn't know I was building her an exit. Cynthia's family welcomed me like I was already part of them. The restaurant was loud and warm, packed with relatives I'd never met, all of them smiling and shaking my hand like I'd just won the lottery. Her uncle, Tito Ben, grabbed my shoulder hard and pulled me into a half-hug. "You are a good man, Garrett," he said, his breath smelling like beer and garlic. "My niece is blessed." I smiled and nodded. I'm the lucky one, I said. He laughed and slapped my back. Lucky, yes, but also good. We see this. We know. Cynthia sat next to me at the long table, her hand resting on my knee under the tablecloth. She was wearing a yellow dress I'd bought her last week, and she looked beautiful. Every few minutes she'd lean over and translate something someone said, laughing, making sure I felt included. I ordered for the table. 8 people, a private room, more food than we could finish. Lechon, lumpia, pancit, grilled fish, plates and plates of rice. The bill would be more than I used to spend on groceries in a month back home, but I didn't care. I wanted them to see I could take care of her, that I wasn't just some old man looking for cheap company. I was serious. I was committed. So when is the wedding? Tito Ben asked halfway through the meal. The table went quiet. Everyone looked at me. Cynthia squeezed my knee. We're not rushing, I said, smiling. We want to finish the house first, get settled. But you will marry her, yes? He pressed. Of course, I said. Absolutely. Cynthia's mother, a small woman with tired eyes, nodded approvingly. Good, she said through Cynthia's translation. My daughter deserves a good husband, a stable life. She'll have it, I promised. I'll make sure of it. The conversation moved on, but I felt the weight of their expectations. They weren't just welcoming me, they were investing in me, trusting me with one of their own. It made me sit up a little straighter, made me want to prove I was worth that trust. Toward the end of dinner I mentioned, casually, that the villa's title would stay in my name until we got married. Just a formality, I said. Something my lawyer back home suggested. I watched Tito Ben's face as I said it. His smile tightened. Just for a second. Then it was back, wide and warm. Of course, he said. That is smart. Protect yourself. But his voice had changed. Cynthia squeezed my hand under the table and leaned close to my ear. Don't worry, she whispered. They just want to protect me too. It's normal. I nodded. I get it, I said. I want to protect you too. She kissed my cheek. I know you do, she said. That's why I love you. After dinner, we walked back to my apartment through streets crowded with vendors and motorbikes and groups of kids kicking a soccer ball under streetlights. Cynthia held my arm and hummed softly. Your family's great, I said. They really are, she agreed. They like you a lot. You think so? I asked. She stopped walking and turned to face me. Garrett, they love you. You gave me something they never could. Security. A future. They see that. I felt a swell of pride. It felt good to be needed, to be useful, to be more than just a sad old man counting down his days. I just want you to be happy, I said. I am, she said, smiling up at me. Happier than I've ever been. That night, lying in bed with her asleep beside me, I stared at the ceiling and replayed Tito Ben's face in my mind. That flicker of something when I mentioned the title. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was projecting my own insecurities. These were good people. They cared about Cynthia. They wanted what was best for her, and what was best for her was me. I was sure of it. I had to be. I spent weeks designing the villa with engineer Reyes, a quiet man in his 40s who wore the same faded polo shirt to every meeting. He'd spread the blueprints across a folding table at the construction site and point at measurements with a chewed-up pencil. Here, sir, we can expand the balcony another meter if you want, he said one afternoon. Will it cost much more? I asked. He shrugged. Maybe 20,000 pesos. But it will look better. More space for chairs, plants. Let's do it, I said. I want it perfect. He nodded and made a note. Cynthia showed up almost every day during construction. She'd arrive in the late morning with bottles of cold water for the workers, wearing jeans and a sun hat, her hair pulled back in a ponytail. She'd walk the site with me, pointing at tile samples, paint swatches, asking questions. What do you think of this color for the kitchen? She'd ask, holding up a sample. I love it, I'd say. Whatever makes you happy. She'd smile and squeeze my arm and move on to the next decision. One afternoon, she stopped in front of the framed-out space that would become the prayer room. I watched her face change. Her eyes filled up and she pressed her hand against her chest. "You really did this?" she said softly. "For my mother." "Of course I did," I said, stepping beside her. "It's important to you. That makes it important to me." She turned and hugged me hard. "You think of everything," she whispered, her voice shaking. I felt her tears on my shirt. "Hey, it's okay," I said, rubbing her back. "It's just a room." "It's not just a room," she said, pulling back to look at me. "It's respect. It's love. Not many men would do this." I kissed her forehead. "I'm not like most men," I said. She laughed through her tears. "No, you're not." The workers watched us from across the site. A couple of them smiled. I felt proud. This was what love looked like. This was what it meant to build a life with someone. But that same afternoon, after Cynthia left, Engineer Reyes pulled me aside. He looked uncomfortable, like he was about to say something he'd been holding in for too long. "Sir," he said quietly, glancing around to make sure we were alone. "I need to tell you something." "What's up?" I asked. He hesitated. "Just be careful, okay?" I frowned. "Careful about what?" "Many foreign men build homes here," he said. "Beautiful homes. For women they meet. Not all of them end well." I laughed it off. "Cynthia's not like that," I said. "She's different." "I hope so, sir," he said. "I really do. She is." I insisted. "We're in love. This isn't some scam." He nodded slowly but didn't look convinced. "Okay, sir. I just wanted to say." He walked away before I could press him further. I stood there watching the workers mix cement, the sun beating down on my neck. His words stuck with me. I tried to shake them off, but they clung like humidity. That night, Cynthia and I had dinner at a small restaurant near the site. I didn't mention what Reyes said, but it sat between us like a third person at the table. "You're quiet tonight," she said, reaching across to touch my hand. "Just tired," I said. "Long day. The villa's coming together beautifully," she said. "You should be happy." "I am happy," I said. And I was, mostly. But somewhere in the back of my mind, a small voice whispered that maybe I should slow down. Maybe I should ask more questions. Maybe I should protect myself a little better. I ignored it. I'd spent 2 years protecting myself after my wife died, and it nearly killed me. I wasn't going back to that. I was all in. I had to be. Love doesn't work any other way. The villa was almost finished when Cynthia started pulling away. It wasn't dramatic. No big fight. No tearful confession. She just stopped being around as much. She'd text me in the afternoon saying she couldn't come by the site. Her mother needed help. Her sister was sick. Family stuff. "Is everything okay?" I asked one night over the phone. "Yeah, why?" she said. Her voice sounded distant. "You just seem busy lately," I said. "I am busy," she said. A pause. "Is that a problem?" No, I said quickly. "I just miss you." "I miss you too," she said, but it didn't sound like she meant it. I told myself it was normal. We'd been spending almost every day together for months. People need space. Relationships ebb and flow. I wasn't going to be that guy who got clingy and needy. But then I saw the credit card charges. I'd given her a card months earlier so she could buy furniture and household stuff for the villa. I trusted her completely. I never even checked the statements. But one night I logged in to pay the bill and my stomach dropped. Cash advances. $3,000 in 2 weeks. I stared at the screen trying to make sense of it. Maybe there was a mistake. Maybe someone stole the card. I called her. "Hey, I need to ask you something," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "What?" she said. She sounded annoyed. "I saw some charges on the card I gave you. Cash advances. What's that about?" Silence. Then I heard her start crying. "Cynthia?" I said. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I didn't want to tell you." "Tell me what?" My chest felt tight. "My brother," she said through tears. "He needed surgery. Emergency. We didn't have the money. I didn't know what else to do. Relief flooded through me. Why didn't you just ask me? I said. I would have helped. I didn't want to burden you, she said. You've already done so much. I thought I could handle it myself. You don't have to handle things yourself, I said. We're a team, remember? I'll pay you back, she said. I promise. Every peso. Don't worry about it, I said. Seriously, family comes first. I get it. She thanked me over and over. Told me I was the best man she'd ever known. I felt guilty for even questioning her. Of course she had a good reason. Of course she wasn't lying. I was being paranoid. But the next week I checked the statement again. Another withdrawal. $1,500. This time I didn't call. I drove to her mother's house where she said she was staying. She was sitting on the porch with her sister, both of them laughing at something on a phone. She looked up and saw me and her face went blank. Garrett, she said, standing up. What are you doing here? We need to talk, I said. Her sister went inside without a word. Cynthia crossed her arms. About what? The money, I said. There's more charges. She didn't cry this time. She just stared at me with cold eyes. You're checking up on me now? She said. That's not what this is, I said. I just want to understand. You don't trust me anymore, she said flatly. That's not true, I said, but my voice wavered. It is, she said. You think I'm stealing from you. I didn't say that, I said. You didn't have to, she said. She turned and walked inside, slamming the screen door behind her. I stood there in the dark, feeling like I'd just lost something I couldn't name. I wanted to go after her, to apologize, to fix whatever I'd broken. But I also wanted answers. I wanted the truth. I drove back to my apartment and sat on the balcony staring at the city lights. My phone buzzed. A text from her. I need space. Please don't contact me for a while. I read it 10 times. I wanted to call her, to beg her to talk to me, but I didn't. I just sat there, my phone in my hand, wondering how everything had fallen apart so fast. And somewhere deep down I knew. I'd seen the crack in the foundation. I just didn't want to admit the whole thing was about to collapse. We moved into the villa on a Sunday. The sky was bright and cloudless, and the air smelled like fresh paint and new wood. Her whole family showed up to help. Tito Ben carried boxes from a truck parked in the driveway. Cynthia's mother swept the floors. Her sister Mila arranged furniture in the living room, but every time I looked at her, she turned away. Cynthia walked through every room slowly, running her hands along the walls, touching door frames, staring out windows. She stopped in the prayer room and stood there for a long time without saying anything. Then she turned and saw me watching from the hallway. Thank you for this, Garrett, she said, her voice thick. I'll never forget what you've done. She crossed the room and hugged me tight. I kissed the top of her head. This is just the beginning, I said. Our beginning. She didn't respond, just held me for another moment and then pulled away. The rest of the day was loud and chaotic. People moving in and out, rearranging things, testing lights, flushing toilets, opening cabinets. Tito Ben cracked jokes and drank beer from a cooler he'd brought. Cynthia's mother cooked food in the new kitchen, filling the house with the smell of garlic and meat. It should have felt like a celebration, like the start of something beautiful, but it felt off, like everyone was performing a role they'd rehearsed. By evening, most of the family had left. Just Cynthia, Mila, and me remained. I ordered pizza, and we ate on the balcony, watching the sun set over the hills. This view, Mila said quietly. It's beautiful. It is, I agreed. Cynthia didn't say anything. She just picked at her food and stared out at the horizon. You okay? I asked her. Yeah, she said, just tired. After we finished eating, Mila excused herself and left. It was just the two of us. Finally, I reached for Cynthia's hand across the table. We did it, I said. We really did, she nodded. We did. So why don't you seem happy? I asked. She pulled her hand back. I'm happy, she said. I just need to adjust. It's a big change. I know, I said, but we'll adjust together. She stood up. I should go, she said. I blinked. Go? Go where? My mother's, she said. Just for tonight. Maybe a few nights. Until things settle. Cynthia, this is our house, I said. We just moved in. I know, she said. I just need a little more time. Time for what? I asked, standing up. She looked at me, and for a second I saw something in her eyes I hadn't seen before. Pity, maybe, or regret. I'll come by tomorrow, she said. She kissed my cheek and walked out. I heard her footsteps on the stairs, heard the front door open and close, heard her motorbike start and fade into the distance. I stood alone in the living room I'd built, listening to the ceiling fan hum above me. The house felt enormous, empty, cold. I told myself it was just an adjustment, that love takes time, that she'd be back tomorrow and everything would be fine. But deep down, standing in that beautiful empty house, I think I already knew. I'd built her a palace, and she'd already moved on. 3 weeks after move-in, I decided to surprise Cynthia. I hadn't seen her in 5 days. She kept texting excuses. Her mother was sick. She had errands. She needed space. I was trying to be understanding, but I was losing my mind. So I bought groceries, planned a simple dinner, and drove to the villa. Maybe if I showed up with food and a smile, she'd remember why we were doing this. Maybe we could talk, really talk. When I pulled up to the gate, my heart stopped. There was a new gate. Tall, black wrought iron with sharp points at the top. And standing in front of it was a security guard I'd never seen before. He stepped forward as I got out of the car. "Sorry, sir," he said, holding up his hand. "No visitors." I laughed. It was such an absurd thing to hear. "I'm not a visitor," I said. "I own this house." He shook his head. "Ma'am, Cynthia said no visitors." "Ma'am, Cynthia?" I repeated. "This is my house. I built it. Check the deed if you want." "I don't have the deed, sir," he said. His voice was polite but firm. "I just have my orders. You are not allowed inside." My hands started shaking. "Call her," I said. "Call Cynthia right now." "I cannot do that, sir," he said. I pulled out my phone and called her myself. It rang twice and went to voicemail. I called again. Voicemail. Again. Voicemail. I sent a text. "I'm at the gate. What's going on?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally, a message came through. "Garrett, please respect my space. I need time to think." I stared at the screen, my vision blurred. "Respect your space?" I said out loud. "I built this fucking house." The guard shifted uncomfortably but didn't move. I looked past him at the villa. My villa? The balcony where Cynthia and I had stood watching sunsets, the garden I'd planted, the prayer room I'd designed for her mother. And then I saw movement inside. A curtain shifted. Someone laughed. I strained to hear. Was that a man's voice? "Sir, you need to leave now," the guard said. "Or what?" I snapped. "You'll call the police? On me? The guy who paid for every brick in that house?" "Please, sir," he said. "I don't want trouble." I stood there for another minute, gripping my phone, staring at the gate. Part of me wanted to scream, to demand entry, to break the lock and storm inside and confront whoever was in there. But what good would it do? I got back in my car and sat with my hands on the wheel, shaking. My phone buzzed. Another text from Cynthia. "I'll explain everything soon. Just give me time." I didn't respond. I just started the engine and drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just drove through the city, past restaurants and markets and crowds of people living their normal lives. I ended up at a beach an hour away. I parked and walked down to the water. The sun was setting. The sky was orange and pink. It was beautiful. I sat in the sand and stared at the waves. I wanted to cry, but nothing came. I just felt empty, hollowed out. I'd spent 2 years of my life and most of my savings building a dream for someone who'd locked me out of it. And the worst part was I still didn't understand why. I thought about my wife, about how we'd fought sometimes, but we always worked it out. How we built a life together brick by brick, year by year. How when she died I thought I'd never feel whole again. And then I met Cynthia and I thought maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe I could start over. Maybe I wasn't too old or too broken. But sitting there on that beach, watching the sun disappear, I realized the truth. I wasn't starting over. I was just running away. And Cynthia saw it. She saw a lonely old man with money and grief, and she took what she needed. I didn't blame her. Not really. I blamed myself for being so desperate, so blind, so stupid. I drove back to my apartment as the sky turned dark. I didn't try calling her again. I didn't text. I just sat on my balcony with a beer and tried to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I hired attorney Domingo the next morning. His office was in a cramped building downtown, up 3 flights of stairs, past a pharmacy and a cell phone repair shop. He was a small man with gray hair and reading glasses that hung on a chain around his neck. He didn't smile when I walked in, just gestured to a chair and said, "Sit." I sat. "I need help," I said. "My girlfriend locked me out of the house I built for her. I need to know my legal options." He nodded like he'd heard this story 1,000 times. "Tell me everything," he said. I did. I told him about meeting Cynthia, about designing the villa, about moving in and her pulling away. I told him about the credit card charges, the new gate, the security guard. He listened without interrupting, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and looked at me over his glasses. "Do you have the title to the property?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Well, it's in process. I was waiting until we got married to finalize everything." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "In process? I signed some documents a few weeks ago," I said. "Cynthia brought them to me during the final walkthrough. She said it was for insurance purposes." Domingo's frown deepened. "Do you have copies of those documents?" "No," I said. "She said she'd give them to me later." He sighed and opened a drawer. He pulled out a folder and flipped through some papers. Then he slid a document across the desk. "Is this your signature?" he asked. I looked at it. My name, my signature, clear as day, and above it, in bold letters, transfer of property title. My stomach dropped. "What is this?" I asked. "This is a title transfer," Domingo said flatly. "You signed over the property to Cynthia Reyes 6 weeks ago." "That's impossible," I said. "She told me it was for insurance." "It's not for insurance," he said. "It's a legal transfer of ownership. The house is hers now, fully and completely." I couldn't breathe. The room felt too small, too hot. "But I paid for it," I said. "I built it. My money." "I understand," Domingo said. "But legally that doesn't matter. You signed the title over. Voluntarily." "I didn't know what I was signing," I said. My voice cracked. "She lied to me." "That may be true," he said. "But proving that in court would be very difficult and very expensive. You'd be fighting for years." "So what are you saying?" I asked. "I'm saying you have no legal claim," he said. "The house is hers. If you try to enter the property without permission, she can have you arrested for trespassing." I stared at him. "This can't be real. I'm sorry, Mr. Garrett," he said. "But it is. There has to be something I can do," I said. He removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. "You could file a civil suit, claim fraud, emotional distress, but you'd need proof, witnesses, documentation, and even then, the courts here favor Filipino citizens in property disputes, especially against foreigners. So I just lose everything?" I said. He nodded slowly. "Yes, most likely." "That's it?" I asked. "Your advice is to just give up?" He leaned forward. "My advice, Mr. Garrett, is to go home, cut your losses, move on with your life. Fighting this will cost you more money, more time, and more pain than it's worth. Trust me." I stood up. My legs felt weak. "How much do I owe you?" I asked. "No charge," he said. "I've seen this too many times." "I'm sorry." I walked out of his office and down the stairs and into the street. The sun was too bright. The noise of the traffic was too loud. I got in my car and sat there with the windows up and the engine off. I didn't cry. I couldn't. I just stared at the steering wheel, trying to process what I'd just heard. I'd lost everything. The villa, the money, the dream, and there was nothing I could do about it. I thought about calling Cynthia, demanding an explanation, screaming at her, but what was the point? She'd won. I'd handed it to her on a silver platter. I started the car and drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to move, to not think, to not feel. I ended up at a park near the bay. I sat on a bench and watched kids play soccer, watched couples walk hand in hand, watched the world go on like nothing had happened, and I realized something. I wasn't angry. I was just tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of hoping. Tired of pretending I wasn't completely and utterly broken. I sent Cynthia one last message that night. I didn't yell, didn't beg. I just needed her to know I still didn't understand. I wrote, "I don't understand why you did this. I loved you. I thought we were building something real." I hit send and put my phone face down on the table. I didn't expect a response. Not after everything. But 2 days later my phone buzzed. A message from her. My hands shook as I opened it. "You were kind, Garrett, but you wanted something I couldn't give. This house, it's for my family. You'll be okay. You always are." I read it 50 times. I dissected every word, looked for hidden meaning, regret, guilt, anything human. But there was nothing, just cold practicality. I wanted something she couldn't give. What did that even mean? Love? Partnership? Honesty? Or did she mean I wanted her to actually care about me as more than a means to an end? I thought about responding, asking her to clarify, to at least pretend she felt bad. But I didn't. What would be the point? She'd said everything she needed to say. The house was for her family. I'd served my purpose, and now I was disposable. That night my son Paul called. We hadn't spoken in 6 months, not since I told him I was staying in the Philippines indefinitely. He'd been angry, said I was running away from my problems, that I was making a mistake. I'd hung up on him. "Dad," he said when I answered. His voice was careful. "I heard what happened. How'd you hear?" I asked. "I've been keeping tabs," he said. I was worried. "Well, you were right," I said. "It was a mistake. A huge fucking mistake." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm sorry," he said. "I really am." "Yeah," I said. "Me too. Come home," he said. "Stay with me and Sarah for a while. Get back on your feet." "I don't know where home is anymore," I said. My voice cracked. "It's not there, Dad," he said gently. "It never was." I hung up, not because I was angry, just because I couldn't keep talking. I looked around the cheap apartment I'd rented near the airport. Bare walls, a mattress on the floor, a suitcase in the corner. This was my life now. I thought about my wife, about the house we'd built together in Massachusetts, the garden she'd planted, the porch where we'd drink coffee on Sunday mornings. I'd left all of that behind because I couldn't stand the memories, couldn't stand the grief, and I'd convinced myself that running away was the same as moving forward. But Paul was right. Home was never here. It was never Cynthia. It was never the villa. I'd just been so desperate not to be alone that I'd given everything to someone who was never really there. I pulled up the photos of the villa on my phone, scrolled through them one by one. The balcony, the kitchen, the prayer room, the garden. It was beautiful. Everything I'd imagined, everything I'd promised her. And I'd lost it all because I'd been too stupid to see what was right in front of me. I deleted the photos, one by one, until my camera roll was empty. It didn't make me feel better, but it felt like something I needed to do, like closing a door I'd left open too long. Before I left Davao, I drove past the villa one last time. I told myself I wouldn't, that it would only make things worse, but I couldn't help it. I needed to see it, just once more. I didn't stop, just slowed down as I passed the gate. The garden was blooming. Bougainvillea climbed the fence. Someone had hung string lights on the balcony. It looked perfect, like a postcard, like a dream someone else was living. I thought about knocking, about asking to see inside one last time. But what would be the point? It wasn't mine anymore. Maybe it never was. I kept driving. At the airport, I sat with my suitcase between my knees, watching people come and go, families reuniting, couples kissing goodbye, old women with too many bags, young men in business suits checking their phones. Everyone had somewhere to be, someone waiting for them. I thought about my wife, how she used to hold my hand during takeoff, how she'd squeeze it tight when we hit turbulence, how I'd taken that for granted. I'd had something real, something solid, and I'd spent 2 years running from it instead of learning to live with the loss. My flight was called. I stood and walked to the gate. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see. On the plane, I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but every time I started to drift off, I saw Cynthia's face, heard her voice, felt her arms around me on that balcony. This is our forever, Garrett. I wondered if she'd felt anything at all, or if I'd just been a project, a problem to solve. A lonely old man with money and no one to spend it on. Maybe I'd never know. Maybe it didn't matter. The plane lifted off and the city disappeared below us. I pressed my forehead against the window and watched until there was nothing left but clouds. I'm back in Massachusetts now. It's colder than I remember. The house feels smaller. The rooms echo when I walk through them. But it's mine. No one can take it from me. No one can lock me out. I haven't talked to Cynthia since that last message. I don't plan to. There's nothing left to say. Sometimes late at night I pull up photos of the villa on my laptop. I know I deleted them from my phone, but I backed them up months ago. I zoom in on the balcony, the prayer room, the garden gate, and I think I built that not for her, for me, because I needed to believe I could still create something beautiful, that I wasn't too broken, too old, too useless. Maybe that's the real tragedy, not that she took it, but that I gave it so easily. My son Paul visited last week. He drove up from California with his wife Sarah. We didn't talk about the Philippines at first. We just sat on the porch drinking coffee, watching snow fall into the yard. "How are you doing?" he asked eventually. I shrugged. "I'm here." "That's something," he said. "Is it?" I asked. He nodded. "Yeah, Dad, it is." We sat in silence for a while. Then he asked, "Do you regret it?" I thought about it, really thought. "I regret who I became," I said. "Not what I built." He didn't push, didn't ask me to explain. He just nodded and refilled my coffee. That night after they left, I walked through the house my wife and I had shared for 30 years. I touched the walls she'd painted, stood in the kitchen where she'd made dinner every Sunday, sat in her chair by the window, and for the first time since she died, I didn't feel crushed by the grief. I just felt sad. A quiet, manageable sadness that I could live with. I'm not healed. I don't know if I'll ever be. But I'm not running anymore. I'm not building monuments to my loneliness. I'm just here, still breathing, still broken, but no longer hers. The villa in Davao still exists. I know because I looked it up online last month. There was a listing for it on a vacation rental site. 3 bedrooms, wraparound balcony, stunning views of the hills, 5-star reviews. Guests raving about the beautiful prayer room and the garden. I read through them all, and I felt nothing. It's just a house now, a place where strangers take photos and sleep in beds I picked out. It's not mine. It was never really mine. I close my laptop and look out the window at the snow piling up in the yard. Spring will come eventually. The snow will melt. The flowers my wife planted will bloom again. And I'll still be here. Older, quieter, maybe a little bit wiser. That's enough. It has to be.